So we will start with the first keynote lecture today, and I would like to present Pascal GIELEN. Pascal GIELEN is a full professor of the sociology of art and politics at the Antwerp Research Institute for the Arts and at the Research Center Arts in Society in Groningen. He is editor-in-chief of the international book series Arts in Society, and in 2016 GIELEN became laureate of the prestigious Odysseus Grant for excellent scientific research of the Fund of Scientific Research Flanders in Belgium. His research focuses on creative labor, the institutional context of the arts, and on cultural politics. GIELEN has published many books which have been translated into English, Korean, Polish, Portuguese, Russian, Spanish, and Turkish. And actually, our topic of the conference is very much related to a book he has been editing, and I think he is very good for us to get into the mood to discuss about art and design education in times of change. So please, Pascal.
First of all, I want to thank NCIA for inviting me for this incredible, international, beautiful public. Also, I want to thank Louise for arranging everything so well. And I didn't know I was the first keynote speaker in the beginning, so I have to apologize to come up with such a annoying subject and maybe heavy policy subject like neoliberalization or something like that. But we live in times of change, and I think neoliberalization has to do with it. We can't put our head in the sand, and we have to look at it. We live in times of change, and I think, like Charlotte already mentioned, it's our responsibility to take it in our hands again, and I try to discuss this today. Just to give an explanation of the picture, this is made by Recetas Urbanas in Spain. It's a group of architects who intervene in public space on the border between the legal and the illegal, between creativity and criminality. And I come later on what I mean by this and what is the function of such making such artistic creative projects nowadays. Anyway, just to start, what I will tell today is based on first the book which was already mentioned. It's Arts Education Beyond Art, and the subtitle is something in times of change. That's why it's related to the conference also. But it is also related to a book which I made very much earlier, I think in 2011. It's called Teaching Art in the Neoliberal Realm. And there is in really the political discussion about what is happening after Bologna in Europe, especially how does it change schools, how can we relate to that as teachers to it, etc. And because I know it's an international public, the subject matter is maybe sometimes too much related to Europe, Bologna, etc. But I came back from Korea just in summertime, and they immediately recognize. So I know, and also when I give lectures in Moscow, they immediately recognize what is it about, or even in Brazil or Mexico. So I think the core of the teach will be, I hope, will be understandable for everybody. Anyway, there I go. Artistic praxis. Maybe I start in Vienna to say a little bit what I mean by artistic praxis and what it is about. And I start with a discussion, but it's not of mine. It's mentioned in a book, but probably, I guess, almost everybody has read here. It's The Craftsman of Richard Sennett. And at a certain moment in The Craftsman of Richard Sennett, there's a discussion about, he discusses an example of craftsmanship, good and bad craftsmanship and art in relationship to that. And he brings up the discussion of Loos and Wittgenstein, who all knows, I think Loos built houses, but what I didn't know of the book was that Wittgenstein also built one house and afterwards still one hut for himself, I think. But anyway, this is the house of Wittgenstein, what you see, and the discussion goes like this. Wittgenstein, let's say it a little bit blunt, is a huge fan of new realism. And he is also a huge fan of Adolf Loos and of his buildings, etc. And that's why he also tries to build, with a lot of money, he had a huge heritage, this house at, I hope I say it right, Kundmangasse in Vienna, which is afterwards, after the building of the house, Wittgenstein was completely not satisfied of this house. He said, it's an illustration of new realism. The house had good manners, but it is lacking primordial life. And you have to know, it's very interesting how he built a house. He was never on the spot. He gave the assignment. Only at the end, when the house was almost finished, he came to look at it, and he saw that the roof was not high enough. He had enough money, so he said, up. It has to get 1 meter higher. And he let it do. So he did money enough so he could follow the rule exactly to build a house, but even afterwards he was not satisfied. And he was very, very, very jealous on Adolf Loos, because Adolf Loos built also in Vienna a beautiful house called Villa Müller, and in the words of Wittgenstein, it was thriving with life, it was full of life. What's the difference between those two houses? Is this discussion Sennett brings in the Craftsman. Well, the difference is the difference was how they, do you understand me? It's okay like that? Oh, sorry. How they build it. I mentioned already how Wittgenstein built it. He built it in theory and then gave it to people to build it. Adolf Loos also drawn it, of course, but he went to show to the house almost day by day how it changed, how it was built. He redrawn when he saw that the light came in, and he redrawn the glasses, etc. of the house. So that's one of the reasons why also Sennett concludes that indeed this house of Loos is thriving with life, it's full of life. And exactly why? Because he doesn't theory, he has theory in the fingers. And that's a huge, very important thing, I think. And that's what I call artistic praxis. Praxis means the embodiment of theory, so it is really doing theory, and it's not an illustration of theory. And this remembered me very much. I'm a sociologist, so I'm schooled in classical sociology, of also an explanation of Pierre Bourdieu, a cultural sociologist, who mentions this also for doing research as a praxis. And he mentions this quote, "Theory without empirical research is empty, and empirical research without theory is blind." It's a little bit the same. This you need concepts, you need words to know what you are doing, but only making an illustration of it, you have big problems. And I think nowadays I come a lot at biennials in it's not, yeah, okay. Yeah?
Could you please keep the mic like this? If you put it like this, the antenna will be covered.
Like that?
No, like it's in the middle.
like that?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Praxis, is it? Yeah. So it's very important to have a kind of this exchange. Now my point is, first of all, when I visit biennials to give lectures all over the world the last 10 years, I see there's a huge problem between this relationship. A lot of biennials, exhibitions, are an illustration of an idea. There is no praxis anymore, what I see. It's an illustration of it, that's one thing. But it starts already much earlier at the art school, where you see that there is always a kind, still, I think, in a lot of art school I come, a kind of gap between theory and practice. I remember even, I think it was the art school St. Lucas in Brussels, where they had in the 70s a separate room for teachers. Theory teachers, practice teachers, because they were always in fight. So, but the relationship between those two is problematic. And until now, I see going on this kind of discussions. But I think, and it's not because I'm a theoretician, but I think theory is very necessary, but it cannot be just illustrated by art. Why is it very necessary? I think to be reflexive, but also to, when you make something new, especially in art, and so you transgress, you completely come with something new, it's very important to explain why it is new, but also to explain why it is art, design, etc. So to explain this and to also, and explaining can be maybe not in words, it can also by showing things, explaining. You need to have, again, theory, I think, very much in your fingers. But integration is important. That's my starting point. This was also the discussion of Richard Sennett in the Craftsman. What do we see now, and what I think is problematic, is especially, and now I'm talking about Europe, that there is a huge problem of integration of those two, finding a balance between theory and practice in education. And especially the policy after Bologna disturbs or can disturb this balance in what I call an artistic biotope of art itself. This biotope is more and more disturbed. I mentioned already a lot of exhibitions are an illustration of theory. That's a disturbance of the balance between those two. But let me talk first about an artistic biotope. What is it about? How does it function? We did research. I did research already for, I think now, 15 years about artistic careers, how it develop, etc. And the last survey we did was for 1,800 creatives in all over Europe, going from opera singers to designers, architects, but also visual artists, etc. And we just asked them the same simple question: is how can you build on the long run a sustainable career? What is necessary to do this? And of course we made afterwards an abstraction of what they said in those interviews. We did not only surveys, we did also in-depth interviews, 70 visits at studios of artists and talked with them, how they work, and designers, etc. And in fact they came up always with what we call 4 fields or 4 domains, which are very much necessary to have an artistic career. And that's what we afterwards called the artistic biotope. You need to work on in the long run. The first sphere, or the first domain in this field, is what we called afterwards the domestic field. The domestic field is home, is the studio where you can work on your own. This is a very important place in that sense that it's a place of what we call, and recognized also, and was characterized also in interviews, as a place of respect. Most of the time, who comes in the studio are friends, boyfriend or girlfriend, family, etc. And it's a small group, a small circle, and people who have respect in each other is a respect relationship. It's also a place of rituals and tradition. Every morning, getting up, taking 3 cups of coffee before I start. Painting, doing something, etc. This ritual movement is very important in the domestic space. And it is a place of intimacy and trust. Most of the artists say, when my boyfriend or girlfriend says, never show this the world, I destroy it. This is very important. You have to trust, of course, people in this space. So that's the domestic space. First space, which is very much needed by creators, they sell. The second one is a situation like this, maybe the peers, where you are in relationship with other professionals. And wherein you build up as a student, for example, at a school, a completely different relationship than in the domestic space. It's a situation of always evaluation. What I mean by that is even when you have a good informal chat with your teacher in a pub with a beer after school, you know you can be, as a student, be evaluated. Everything what you said can be evaluated. So in the peers, you are always in a social relationship of evaluation. Even it's also of respect, etc., like in domestic sphere, evaluation is always in the game. You are for the first time, a lot of students certainly confronted for the first time with the canon. What is art history? What are the main practices in your field? So knowledge-based relationship. And it's also a place of, when it works well, of negotiation and discussion. I always use the same anecdote of the teacher who comes in the classroom, in the studio, somebody is painting there, and the teacher says, oh no, my God, Van Gogh did this already 100 years ago. And then the student says, no, I do something else. There the discussion starts with the canon. So this is a very important moment in finding your own way. That's the place of the peers. When you want to make a living of it, you need also another space, you need a market. But I define the market very broad. It can be also that you are subsidized by government. It means the exchange of what you do, your creative artistic praxis, in money. That's all. That's for me a market. When you go on the market, you know you're always in a game of competition. Even when you go for a subsidizing by government or you go for a grant, you know there is competition with other artists. And when you get it, maybe somebody else doesn't get it. So it's always competition. It's a relationship of what I call quantities. A very important quality of the market is that you learn to quantify yourself. You learn to quantify your own qualities. You learn, for example, to deal with a deadline. But you also learn to count how much time do I need to make the product. Or you need to count how much does it cost to make it, etc., etc. So quantification is a very important quality of characteristic of the market situation. We all know it's about money, money relationships, and trade and exchange. I always use the auction as a kind of ideal type of the market because it's a pure market. When you go to an auction, the only thing what you need to get the work is money. You bid, you can be anonymous, you don't need to know anything about art history, you don't need to know the artist or the designer, etc. The only thing you need to know, to have is the money to pay, enough money. That's a pure market. Saying this means also a lot of markets, and especially art markets, are not pure markets. You cannot go to Zinuix, the gallery of Luc Tuymans in Belgium, and buy, even when you have 20 million with you, and buy a Luc Tuymans. You never get out with that. He will first check you. You have to go dinner with the artist, and etc., etc. So what I wanted to say is that art markets, in this pure model, don't always exist. They are mixed up. I mentioned there also the names of John Locke and especially Adam Smith. You all know them, I guess. Especially Adam Smith was a kind of, let's say, a liberal defender of the market system for a whole society. But I mention him here because there is a very interesting remark in the work of Adam Smith, and especially liberal intellectuals try to, put this sometimes under the table. That is that Adam Smith remarked already, we can organize whole society as a market, but there has to be spaces free of the market, otherwise you just destroy the market system itself. And he mentions two, I come later to this, healthcare and education. Don't organize them as a market themselves, when you do this, you destroy the market system on the long run. Anyway, last space, what is mentioned, what is necessary for artists to survive, is what I call the civil space. The space, the museum, for example, the place where you represent your work, where you also have to argue why you do what you do. So this is another space than the market. It is not finding consumers who buy a ticket and come to look at you. No, it is finding a public understanding, embedding of your work. So here, the discussion about quality is important, finding public value, debate, arguments, etc. Also, for example, when you argue in an, how do you call it? An application, for example, for a grant, etc., and you argue for a government, for example, I want to do this exhibition because 1, 2, 3, 4, you are arguing. You're in the civil space at that moment, because I think it's necessary, it's not done yet, etc. Last remark, we need all four spaces. That's a very important thing as an artist, and you need to find a balance, otherwise you get huge problems. For example, we interviewed Luc Tuymans, the famous Belgian painter, but also Marlene Dumas, the Dutch painter, and they are very successful, but they have also huge problems, especially Luc Tuymans. It's a public thing, so I can say it, has a drinking problem, a serious one. But a lot of artists mention, when you wanted to visit them at the studio, they said, come before 11 o'clock, because afterwards they start drinking. So there is a huge problem we cannot neglect in the special fields. It's also with opera singers, it's less with dancers, and we can recognize why, but anyway. And it has to do because there is no balance anymore in this biotope. They are always in the market and in the civil space, and they cannot go back, for example, to the domestic space and the peers. It's especially Luc Tuymans who mentioned in the interview, it's awful to be 10 years, 15 years successful, because what happens then? You're always in the civil space or in the market space, and you are surrounded more and more by people who say, well done, Luc Tuymans. But they never criticize you anymore in a very good way. They don't dare to, because they are your fans, etc., etc. So you're losing your, what they call your critical mass by being successful at a certain moment. And so this is also a problem. You cannot go back anymore in an organic way to the peers. So again, some artists also organized for themselves things to go back to the peers. And this, I think, is very important. The other way around, when you only stay in the domestic sphere or peers and never go to the market or civil space, you're not a professional artist or designer. You are just doing creativity or something like that, creative therapy, etc. for yourself, but it is not a professional base. So balance is very important. Okay. Now I want to take back the discussion about this relationship between theory and practice in the biotope. How are they related in those four fields to each other? First, the domestic sphere. I go very quick to this. First, in the domestic sphere, what is happening there? In fact, there needs not to be a connection between both. You can, just to give one example, maybe everybody recognizes, we have very good theorists and critics of music. Or you write about classical music, they are very much recognized, etc. They have also, most of them have also a piano at home, but they never dare to play in public. They are not good musicians. They are good theoricians, but not good musicians, even when they practice, and they know. The other way around, we know you can do a lot of blurring, a lot of experimenting in the studio, etc., without theorizing. Even my boy of, he's now older, but when he was 4 or 5 years, was drawing things. And I say, good, well done. Of course, it's nothing to do with theory. It's just a practice, etc. So there need to be, that's my main point, there need not to be, in the domestic space, a connection between those two. And I go faster because I feel already I'm losing time. The only place where there is a natural relationship or can build up is at school. And it's also for the first time that students, most of the students are confronted with theory, etc. So there it has to happen. This is for me very important. The interaction between theory and praxis is there in the peers and stays going on in the peers when you are, for example, confronted in an open studio with a curator, and you have a discussion, etc. So this is the place where theory and practices always in an organic way, or can be in an organic way, mix up. That's why I stress it so much. It's very important for schools to find a good way, to find an integration between those two. Because also in the market, it's not organic related to each other, theory and practice. We all know that there are a lot of artists who sell well and make their paintings and has never be theorized at all. They have even the galleries in New York, etc. I don't mind, but in my eyes, they have no integration of those two. At the other way around, I mentioned already the biennial system nowadays. You have beautiful theoretical ideas which are used as marketing strategies, but which are not covering what is happening there in the artistic field. And the artistic field feels sometimes that they have to illustrate it. So there is also not a kind of organic connection necessary in the market domain. In the civil domain, sometimes there is. It's very interesting. I did myself research in a committee of the Flemish government, which subsidized visual artists. I was there for a year in their discussions just to observe how they discussed. And you see a lot of interesting, they show, first thing, but so this artist, will we subsidize him, her, or him not? They show pictures or discuss the work, but they immediately also use theoretical concepts, sometimes in a completely wrong way, but anyway, they use it to understand what they're doing. And there is, you see this also, this kind of mixture. Anyway, this is the relationship between theory and practice in the biotope, and I stress again, education plays a very important role and phase also to make this relationship organic. What is happening now with the biotope nowadays? To explain this, I jump to what I call a macro-sociological level. What is happening in the world nowadays to our education system, etc. This is happening. The world is becoming more and more flat and wet. We are a little bit back in the Middle Ages. We are surfing on the net from project to project, but also teachers go from one school to the other. More and more guest teachers, guest professors come in schools, and it's a good thing. I don't want to say this, but they also jump for maybe 1 year, 2 years, one project to another. That's the kind of situation we are more and more in. It has to do, and I go very quick through this, with 3, I think, very important shifts in society in general, maybe even global, the last 30 years. What is interesting for me, they all happened the same last 30 years. One is on the political level, what I call, especially for Europe, the shift from the welfare state to a more neoliberal concept of thinking of the state, which I call repressive liberalism, not neoliberalism, but I come to this later, what this is about. This, of course, happened. I can easily relate to everybody who knows Reagan, Thatcher, etc., when the shift moves from kind of welfare thinking of state. But also what I call, that's why I call it post-political, there is less and less difference between left and right, liberal parties and socialist parties. Of course, this happens differently with the fall of the Berlin Wall, etc. That's all history, you know. But it happens also for me, especially in the creative field, when Tony Blair embraces Bono of U2. At that moment, the whole creative industries is hyped and is by a socialist politician is hyped in an economical sense. At that moment, we see something changing in the field. There is also a huge shift at the same time, starting from the 70s, from Fordism to post-Fordism. I don't go too depth in this, but Fordism comes from Henry Ford. He has a system to, in a very regular way, to build cars. We know also that from the 70s on, design comes in, etc. Creativity becomes more and more important. So post-Fordism stands for flexible working, creative work, authenticity at the shop floor, etc. Then the surfing starts. Already on the surface. You've jumped from project to project as a freelance designer, curator, etc. And very interesting, in the art field, you see also a shift from modern to contemporary art. In a way, history is skipped out. And you see it literally. The art historian has almost no say anymore nowadays in the professional field. You never see them talking anymore, never, on biennials. They have not a voice. It is all made up by theoricians, Michael Hart, Antonio Negri, etc., Rossière. So there is a kind of shift also there, and what I call the shift to the contemporary. History is neglected more and more in this field. And contemporary means, contemporary is the contemporary. It has no future and it has no past. This is what is happening now. Sometimes I also say blunt, who shouts the loudest is now, at the moment in the field. And a lot of you would say, oh, he is talking again about postmodernism. This is over, postmodernism. I know this in the intellectual field the last 10 years, when you talk about postmodernism, they shoot you. But I think, and that's my bet, we still live in practice very much in this postmodern condition, how the world is organized nowadays. Anyway, now the most heavy thing of the morning, and I apologize for that, but this has to do with what I call, in a political sense, I mentioned this shift of repressive liberalism. I don't speak anymore about neoliberalism, because when you take the word literally, neoliberalism means new freedom. It has nothing to do with new freedom at all, the system in which we are. It has to do, in fact, with the regression of freedom. And that is what I try to explain by repressive liberalism. I try to explain it by three quotes, and you will immediately see how it is related to art schools. The first one comes from Hans Achterhuis. It's a Dutch philosopher, and he mentioned this in the book. I don't know if it's translated in English or German. It is the book, The Utopia of the Free Market, in English. And this quote comes out of it. He says, while governments cut back everywhere and relegate tasks to the market, the supervisors who must guard the freedom of that market grow and grow and grow. See the very interesting contradiction. You say, give it to the free market, but at the same time, the control system to control this free market is growing and growing. This stands for the paradox, repressive liberalism, repressive freedom. what is it? He gives an example to explain this, and the example is the healthcare system in the Netherlands. He says in 2006 there was voted a new law in the Netherlands which privatized the healthcare system. And what is very interesting is the percentage, the part of the GDP for healthcare in 2005, so before the voting of this law, was 7.5% of the Dutch GDP. In 2008, 2 years after the voting of this law, the part of healthcare in the GDP was already 13.2%. Very strange. How does it come? You say free market, free competition, prices go down. No, prices went up. Why is the question of Hans Achterhuis. Well, why? When you introduce a free market system in healthcare, of course you have to control the quality of healthcare, of hospitals, medicines, etc. But that they did already before. They did it by state control, centralized. What did they do in the Netherlands? They also privatized control. So you get a competition of a lot of offices, private offices, who control healthcare, and they are in competition to follow the rule holier than the Pope. So at that moment you get a very rigid, expensive system. First of all, because you also have to pay those companies who do the control, but secondly, they make a very rigid system because they compete for the best control, and especially people in hospitals like surgeons, etc., have to follow more and more this rule, and of course they have to fill out also a lot of forms, and now we come more and more to education to say that they are followed in control, etc., etc. I still have 5 minutes. Okay, thank you. Education. I worked for 10 years in the Netherlands in university and Fontes School of the Arts, and in those 10 years I had 7 audits and accreditations together. And the last company who did the pre-audition of the art school the company was called Control. Because control is a good thing. It stands for quality. And this is the thing what is happening, I think, more and more in the educational system. At one side, governments say, organize you're free to organize your own education, etc. But at the same time, we control and we organize also the control in a decentralized way. This is a kind of very strange situation in which we're in. I know I have 5 minutes, so I go very fast. But this is what is happening also, I think, and the influence of Bologna then on art schools. I mentioned already repressive liberalism. That means because standardization of Bologna. I hope I don't have to explain Bologna, but anyway, let's say it is about standardization of education, and that's a good thing, that there can be good exchange between, for example, Vienna and Amsterdam and Brussels, etc. for students. So that's a good thing. But when you standardize education on a huge page, of course, schools become competitors for each other. They fight for students. We are better than the other. We want more students. Students are also counted. So schools define themselves more and more as a kind of private company, which is in competition. You get more and more interesting contract relationships between students and teachers. I know my former director at the Fontes School of the Arts in Tilburg, the last 2 weeks of this academic year in June, he made his time free for this last 2 weeks. He was only dealing with lawyers who phoned and asked why a student didn't get a grade or a diploma. So this is a contract. They define themselves in the contract. You say you deliver me this, I get this. This is more and more a situation. So, and the student is defined as an entrepreneur from day one. You have to find yourself a way out. Anyway, you see an increase of scale. A lot of, I think, in the Fonte School of the Arts, were at the end were 12 schools together, 12 academies. So you see also standardization in the school system. Competentors had to be counted. You need to have so much contact hours, etc., to control. And especially administration management is centralized enormously. And you get in more and more what I call neo-management. Neo-management means that you can, and this is only possible in digital age, that you can control everybody and every teacher on the individual level. Right? You do this kind of assessments with everybody, personal evaluation talks, etc. And what comes in the system is what I call more and more a catering regime. The school becomes a kind of catering of education. I go very quick to this, but this has an effect to the biotope. It means literally that a market, not a market in the kind of sense of commercial things, but a market as a quality, quantifying things, measuring things, also is going to define other spaces. And especially, let's look at the school, we see coming in counting. Counting the competences, counting the contact hours, creative industries, formatting things in courses, etc. Okay, I skip this because it has an interesting effect, I think, anyway. And I go immediately to the system of schools, how it is organized more and more, and where the problems are also, I think, in the relationship between practice and theory. First of all, we see enormous rationalization of the space. I know from my sister, who is, in fact, a bad artist, but anyway, she doesn't practice anymore, but she was in an art school in the 70s, all happened there at night. In the studios, etc., with wine, with other teachers. I don't know what happened there all. But anyway, this was the space of inspiration. Now, the space, I know it from the school where I experienced, is rented in the evening for other private companies. So space is rationalized. The cafeteria is literally given to the catering service. It's privatized. It's not anymore the mom of a student or a teacher who makes the breads at a certain moment. So every space is rationalized in this. Contact hours I mentioned already. You see a lot of outsourcing, security, for example. When I made just one anecdote, I know a teacher of theater in Fonte School of the Arts who wanted to do a theater piece with his students early in the morning with the sunrise at 4 or 5 o'clock. He had to pay the security 500 euros each day to open the building earlier. This is what I mean by this occupying, by outsourcing. You get an obsession for measurement everywhere, also in teaching. And I think that's the opposite. Art, but also design, creativity, needs the opposite. It needs not measurement, it needs dismeasurement. It needs a way to break open the system. And this is very important. There I come to my artistic praxis. You need places for informality, intimacy, which are most of the time cannot be rationalized. A violinist we interviewed mentioned I lost his name, a very famous Belgian one. He said to me, the moment that I knew I could it was this 3 words of a teacher in the corridor of the school, There it happened, oops. And that's what we need, and that's what is, again, over-rationalized, over-calculated today. So, school, to end maybe, has to go back to this original meaning in Old Greek, and the original meaning of schole in Old Greek means free time. That's the meaning of school. Right? And free time is not leisure time. Free time means that you are separate from power, from politics, separate from the economical system. Think again about Adam Smith. Never make a market system of your schools to organize this. And that's my last please. So what we have to try to do from schools as civil public institutions, this is for me very important, is try to make common fields back in those spaces. And we see a lot of attempts to this. Creative Commons, we can discuss it's good or bad, but anyway, this is a very important thing. Because also in interviews, a lot of artists and designers say this, we need free entrance to, and free, especially free, not free like free beer, but free like free speech. We need entrance to things which are free we can use again to be creative. It's our source. It's very much necessary. And I think schools can do this, to bring in common knowledge, to give free classes, never discuss again if you could put classes on the web or not, do it. Show it for free, don't count your students anymore. So bringing in common knowledge is for me a very important resistance. I only want to end with two pictures I very much like, because this represents trying to make the common true art, true paint. But especially I like very much what they did with the television. It's still playing. And they say, no, this is our field, this is our space. I think trying to give the space again is a very important thing to learn to artists, designers, etc. Make your own space, dare to make your own space, not format. And that's my last slide, why I do use this. And it's also referring to the starting point, recetas urbanas. I think in schools we have to learn nowadays, designers, artists, etc., not only to make nice design, but also learn to dare to go on the border between the legal and the illegal, between creativity and criminality. This is an example. Is this art? A lot of you say, no, totally not. And others say, yes, we can make it. And this very strange, interesting border is for me very interesting. So this means also in our schools that we have to learn to teach or learn our students to deal with society, to go in public, to make, not to go in public space because it doesn't exist, to make public space again. And this happens exactly at this very strange border between creativity and criminality, the legal and the illegal. So I go for more illegal things. Thank you.